political and social unrest. With the Vietnam War not being supported by many American citizens, they would have riots and anti-war events so that America would leave the war in Vietnam. Many Americans felt that we had no right to interfere with the problems in Vietnam, and they did not like the idea of American soldiers on the soil of a faraway country, especially when they do not feel we should be there. On October 21st, 1967, one of the most famous protests took place about the Vietnam War. Some 100,000 protesters gathered at Lincoln Memorial protesting about ending the war. Some 30,000 of the original 100,000 continue in a march to the Pentagon later that night. The protesters confronted the U.S. Marshal and soldiers that were protecting the building. The protesters assaulted the soldiers and deputies. What they used were vegetables, rocks, and bottles. A full-scale riot erupted from this event. Hundreds of these protesters got arrested. There were plenty more protests throughout the war. Many protests were happening on college campuses. The climax of the protests on campuses came when Nixon ordered an attack on Cambodia. In the Vietnam War, the draft was used to get many of the troops we had. Around two-thirds of the troops of the U.S. were volunteers, while the other one-third roughly were drafted into the war. So young men began refusing to take part in the draft. They did not feel inclined to have to fight in this war, nor wanted to. As early as May of 1964, protesters of the draft began a slogan that stated, "We won't go," and they said this in protests. People who had already registered to take part in the draft, if selected, would burn their draft cards. Due to all the protests in around October of 1967, organized draft card turn-in areas were all over the country. Now during the war, they were the Doves and Hawks. The Doves were against the war and did not believe that we should take part in the war. Now Hawks, on the other hand, were with the war and thought we needed to help out in Vietnam and do what we needed to do. But the amount against the war was much greater, so by January 1973, Nixon announced the U.S. effective end to the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam due to the strong anti-war mandate.